History remembers explosions. It remembers flags raised over ruined cities. But it often forgets the moment everything became unstoppable. In the early hours of a frozen dawn, millions of boots moved at once, not toward glory, not toward revenge, but toward finality. This was not a battle. It was not even a campaign. It was the moment the Red Army unleashed the largest coordinated military offensive the world had ever seen, an operation so vast, so relentless, that entire enemy armies simply collapsed. And once it began, there was no stopping it. Before we go deeper, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment. Your support helps us bring more powerful, true history to life. Now, let's begin. By the summer of 1944, the Eastern Front of World War II no longer resembled a battlefield. It resembled a breaking point. For nearly 3 years, the Soviet Union had absorbed devastation on a scale modern warfare had never produced. Entire cities reduced to ash. Millions of soldiers killed, captured, or missing. Villages erased from maps. Families scattered across a continent of ruins. And yet, against every expectation, the Red Army had survived. Not only survived, it had learned. Early disasters had forged a brutal education. Soviet commanders studied failure with cold discipline. They adapted tactics, reorganized command structures, and rebuilt their forces with relentless efficiency. Factories beyond the Ural Mountains worked day and night, producing tanks, artillery, aircraft, and ammunition in staggering quantities. By 1944, the Red Army was no longer reactive. It was preparing something decisive. German intelligence noticed the buildup, but misunderstood its scale. They saw troop movements, rail congestion, fuel stockpiles, but what they failed to grasp was coordination. This would not be a single breakthrough. This would be everything, everywhere, all at once. Across thousands of kilometers, Soviet forces assembled quietly. Infantry divisions reinforced. Armored corps repositioned under camouflage. Artillery units rolled into concealed firing positions. Their guns aligned with mathematical precision. Every bridge, every road, every river crossing, mapped, measured, timed. The plan was known as Operation Bagration, named after an 18th-century Russian general. But the name itself mattered less than its purpose: to annihilate Army Group Center, the backbone of German forces on the Eastern Front. Not push them back, not weaken them, destroy them. Soviet deception played a critical role. Fake troop concentrations were staged in the south, convincing German command that the main attack would target Ukraine. Radio traffic was manipulated. False supply movements were deliberately exposed. Meanwhile, the real strike force massed in silence. On the German side, complacency had crept in. After years of brutal combat, many officers believed the front had stabilized. Defensive lines were thin but extended. Reserves were limited. Armor was scarce. Worst of all, German leadership underestimated Soviet operational capability. They believed the Red Army could attack. They did not believe it could coordinate on this scale. On the night before the offensive, Soviet soldiers waited in their positions. Some slept, some cleaned weapons. Others simply stared into the dark. There were no speeches, no dramatic announcements, only orders. At precisely synchronized times, across multiple fronts, Soviet artillery opened fire. The sound was not thunder. It was continuous pressure, like the ground itself tearing apart. German trenches vanished in seconds. Communication lines were severed instantly. Command posts disintegrated under concentrated bombardment. Entire defensive sectors ceased to exist before soldiers could even report contact. Then came the infantry, wave after wave, advancing behind rolling barrages. Not reckless charges, but methodical, rehearsed movement. Engineers cleared paths through minefields. Tanks followed tightly coordinated routes. Aircraft struck rear positions, bridges, and supply hubs. German units attempted to respond, but the structure was gone. Orders couldn't reach the front. Reinforcements couldn't move. Retreat routes were already under fire. Within days, German divisions that had held ground for years were surrounded. Not pressured, encircled. Entire corps were trapped, isolated, and crushed. What made this offensive unprecedented wasn't just numbers. It was integration. Infantry, armor, artillery, air power, logistics, all operating in unified tempo. a machine designed not for attrition but for collapse. As the Red Army advanced, the front didn't bend. It broke. Cities fell not after long sieges, but in rapid succession. Roads clogged with abandoned equipment. Prisoners were taken in numbers so large they strained Soviet logistics. German command struggled to understand what was happening. But by the time clarity arrived, it was already over. The German front did not retreat. It disintegrated. Within days of the Red Army's opening strikes, Army Group Center, the strongest German formation on the Eastern Front, ceased to function as a coordinated force. Divisions that had survived years of warfare were suddenly cut off from command, from supply, from each other. Maps became meaningless. Orders arrived too late, or not at all. German officers tried to reorganize under impossible conditions. Roads were jammed with abandoned vehicles. Fuel ran out. Ammunition stocks vanished under relentless pressure. Units that attempted to fall back discovered their retreat paths already sealed. This was not chaos by chance. It was design. The Red Army did not simply punch holes in the line. It bypassed strongpoints, surrounded entire formations, and advanced deep into the rear. Speed mattered more than territory. Encirclement mattered more than headlines. Every movement had been calculated weeks in advance. Soviet tank armies surged forward, not waiting for perfect conditions. Engineers rebuilt bridges under fire. Supply columns followed relentlessly, sometimes using captured enemy equipment to keep momentum alive. For German soldiers on the ground, the experience was disorienting. The sky was no longer theirs. Soviet aircraft dominated roads and railways, striking columns before they could reorganize. German air support, once feared, was thin, delayed, or absent altogether. Communication collapsed, and without communication, modern armies do not fight. Entire German regiments vanished from records, swallowed by encirclement so vast that surrender became the only rational option. Prisoners were taken by the tens of thousands, not after long resistance, but because resistance no longer had purpose. Some German officers attempted breakouts. Few succeeded. Soviet commanders, having learned hard lessons earlier in the war, sealed pockets methodically. They did not rush. They did not waste lives. Artillery applied pressure. Negotiations followed. Then capture. The scale was unprecedented. Within weeks, Army Group Center lost hundreds of thousands of men, killed, captured, or scattered beyond recovery. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Tanks, artillery, trucks, entire inventories wiped out. German high command reacted with disbelief. Reports from the front were dismissed as exaggerated. Requests for retreat were denied or delayed. Leadership clung to maps that no longer reflected reality. But reality had already moved west. Cities once considered secure fell rapidly. Minsk, key to German control in the region, was surrounded and taken. Supply depots burned. Rail hubs fell intact into Soviet hands. The momentum did not slow. It accelerated. What made this offensive so devastating was not brutality, but precision. The Red Army no longer relied on sheer sacrifice. It used timing, deception, coordination, and overwhelming material advantage. Soviet commanders controlled the tempo, choosing when to strike, when to pause, and where to push hardest. German defenses had no room to recover. Every attempt to form a new line failed before it could solidify. And with each collapse, the psychological toll deepened. German soldiers no longer asked how to win. They asked how to survive. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers advanced with grim focus. This was not celebration. This was completion. Many had lost families, homes, entire childhoods. They did not see this as conquest, but as closure. Still, discipline held. Civilians were handled under strict orders. Logistics followed rules refined through years of hardship. The Red Army had learned that victory required control, not chaos. International observers later struggled to comprehend the scale. Western Allied commanders, preparing operations of their own, studied reports with astonishment. Never before had such massive forces moved with such synchronization. Across such distances, Operation Bagration was no longer just an offensive. It was a turning point that reshaped the entire war. Germany could not replace what it lost. Not in men, not in equipment, not in time. The Eastern Front, once the core of German military power, had been shattered beyond repair, and the road forward lay open. Far from the collapsing front lines, the impact of the Red Army's offensive was being felt in quiet, rooms filled with maps, radios, and hurried calculations. London, Washington, Berlin, and even neutral capitals that had spent years watching the war from a careful distance. Operation Bagration didn't just destroy German armies, it reset global expectations. For Allied leaders in the West, the speed of the Soviet advance forced a recalculation. Plans that had been based on gradual German resistance suddenly felt outdated. The Eastern Front was no longer a pressure point, it was a breaking point. British and American intelligence officers struggled to verify reports. Entire German formations gone, cities falling weeks ahead of schedule, rail networks collapsing faster than they could be sabotaged. At first, some assumed exaggeration. Then aerial reconnaissance confirmed it. The Red Army had advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, doing what many had believed impossible only a year earlier. The German military, once feared for its efficiency, was bleeding strength, at a rate it could not replace. This changed everything. In the West, Allied commanders understood that the race toward Germany had accelerated. The question was no longer if Germany would lose, but how quickly, and who would arrive where first. Strategic urgency increased overnight. Supply chains were expanded. Timetables shortened. Risks recalculated. Operation Overlord, the Allied landings in Western Europe, had already begun, but Bagration ensured something crucial. Germany could not shift forces east or west to stabilize either front. They were trapped between two unstoppable forces, and the pressure never let up. German leadership tried desperately to contain the damage. Emergency units were formed from training schools. Older soldiers were recalled. Youth formations were rushed to the front with minimal preparation. None of it mattered. The industrial imbalance was now undeniable. The Soviet Union was producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. Coordination between infantry, armor, and air support had reached a level once thought exclusive to German doctrine. The student had surpassed the teacher. Meanwhile, morale within Soviet ranks transformed. For years, soldiers had fought defensively, holding ground, absorbing losses, pushing back inch by inch. Now, for the first time, they advanced with confidence. Not recklessness, confidence. They trusted their leadership. They trusted their planning. And most importantly, they trusted that the sacrifices had meaning. Villages liberated along the way bore scars of occupation, but also signs of survival. Civilians emerged cautiously, unsure whether this moment was real or temporary. Soviet troops were under strict orders: maintain discipline, secure infrastructure, keep moving. The offensive had a goal larger than vengeance. It was about ending the war. Across Europe, resistance movements took notice. News traveled quietly but powerfully. German forces were no longer untouchable. The myth of inevitability was breaking. Underground networks intensified their efforts, sensing that the balance had finally tipped. Even within Germany, cracks formed. Military officers who had once believed in ultimate victory began preparing for survival. Civilians noticed changes too. Shortages worsening, propaganda growing louder, promises growing thinner. The war was reaching its final act. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Bagration was not what it destroyed, but what it proved. It proved that modern warfare was no longer about singular brilliance or elite units. It was about systems, logistics, coordination, adaptation. The Red Army had evolved under unimaginable pressure. Mistakes had been paid for dearly in earlier years, but those lessons had been absorbed, refined, and weaponized into something unstoppable. Historians would later describe Operation Bagration as the most decisive land offensive in history, not because of spectacle, but because of consequence. After it, Germany could no longer mount a strategic defense in the East. After it, Allied victory became a matter of timing. And after it, the shape of post-war Europe was no longer theoretical. It was being written in real time, mile by mile. The offensive continued westward, and with every step the end moved closer. By the time the guns quieted, the map of Europe no longer looked the same. Operation Bagration did not end the war overnight, but it made the ending inevitable. What remained of the German forces in the East were no longer armies in the traditional sense. They were fragmented units, stretched thin, reacting instead of planning. The ability to launch large-scale counteroffensives was gone. Strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Red Army. From that moment forward, the direction of the war flowed one way, westward. As Soviet forces continued advancing through Eastern Europe, the consequences of Bagration extended far beyond the battlefield. Countries that had lived under occupation for years now faced a new reality. Liberation came with complex political futures. Warsaw, Budapest, Bucharest. Each city carried its own scars, its own hopes, its own fears. The Red Army arrived not just as a military force, but as a symbol of an approaching post-war order. For some, it represented survival. For others, uncertainty. History would judge these moments with nuance, but there was no denying the scale of change unfolding. In Germany itself, the impact was profound. Military leadership, fractured between those who still believed in prolonging the fight and those who understood the outcome was sealed. Resources were exhausted. Industrial centers were under constant pressure. Civilian morale declined as reality contradicted years of confident promises. The idea of total victory had collapsed. What remained was damage control. In the West, Allied forces advanced steadily. Now fully aware that Germany was fighting a war it could no longer win, coordination between fronts became less about survival and more about positioning. Who would reach which cities, which borders would solidify, and how influence would be distributed once the fighting stopped. This was the silent consequence of Bagration. It didn't just defeat an enemy. It decided the balance of the post-war world. When the war finally ended in 1945, historians traced the collapse backward through battles, offensives, and decisions. Again and again, their analysis returned to the summer of 1944, to the forests and rivers of Eastern Europe, to the offensive that erased entire formations and shattered illusions. Operation Bagration became a case study in transformation. A military force that had once suffered devastating defeats learned, adapted, and emerged stronger. It demonstrated how resilience, planning, and coordination could reshape outcomes, even against an opponent once considered unbeatable. But it also carried a deeper lesson. Wars are not decided by moments alone. They are decided by systems, by the ability to learn faster than the enemy, by endurance when the cost feels unbearable. The Red Army paid an extraordinary price to reach that point. The offensive was not born from confidence alone. It was forged through years of sacrifice, loss, and hard-earned experience. That reality matters, because history is often remembered in headlines, but shaped in quieter decisions made far from the spotlight. Operation Bagration is remembered today not for a single dramatic image, but for what it changed forever. It ensured that the war in Europe would end. It shaped borders that would define generations, and it marked the moment when momentum became destiny. In modern military academies, the offensive is still studied, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of how quickly power can shift when preparation meets opportunity. And for the millions whose lives were altered by its outcome, its legacy is not theoretical, it is personal. The Red Army's greatest offensive did more than push an enemy back. It pushed history forward. And once it began, there was no turning back.